The morning of the 3rd of November, 1878 started like any other on the Nebraska frontier. The sun crested over endless plains, casting long shadows across the modest homestead where Mary Harson lived with her 3 children. 10-year-old Daisy was already helping with morning chores, while 4-year-old Mabel and 2-year-old Jessie played nearby. But as dawn broke, something else stirred in that house. Stephen D. Richards, 22 years old, with steel-gray eyes and an unsettling calm, quietly rose from his bed. He walked outside, selected a sturdy spade, and began digging a hole in the cold Nebraska soil. What happened next would earn Richards a place in history as Nebraska's first documented serial killer. By nightfall, 4 innocent lives would be extinguished by an axe in the hands of a man who felt nothing but satisfaction at his work. The bodies of an entire family would disappear into that pre-dug grave, and a killer would sit down calmly to eat breakfast, the blood of children still fresh beneath his fingernails. This wasn't Richards' first murder. By his own confession, it wouldn't be his last, but it would be the crime that finally brought Nebraska's most cold-blooded predator to justice. Before we dive into the full story of Stephen D. Richards, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell. The case we're covering today involves some disturbing content, so viewer discretion is advised. This is the true story of the man they called the Nebraska Fiend. Stephen Decatur Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia on the 18th of March, 1856. The America of his birth was a nation on the edge of civil war, but the Richards family lived a quiet existence far from the political tensions brewing across the country. He was said to have had 5 sisters and a brother. When Stephen was just 6 years old, his world changed dramatically. The family relocated to Ohio, first to Monroe County and then to Noble County. Eventually, they settled in the small Quaker village of Mount Pleasant, Ohio, when Stephen was 11. This religious community would shape his early years, though not in the way his devout Methodist mother had hoped. Richards later described his mother as a devout Methodist and his father, a farmer, as having made no profession of religion. The contrast between his parents' spiritual lives may have contributed to the moral vacuum that would later define Stephen's character. His mother insisted he attend church and Sunday school regularly, creating a facade of religious devotion that masked something much darker developing beneath the surface. Richards attended school in Mount Pleasant. He claimed that the teachers considered him well behaved. To everyone around him, Stephen appeared to be a model child from a respectable family. He was articulate, intelligent, and knew how to present himself as the kind of young man any parent would be proud to know. This ability to charm and deceive would become one of his most deadly weapons. The first crack in this perfect facade appeared when Stephen was 15. On the 16th of September, 1871, Richard's mother died of an unknown cause. The loss of the moral anchor in his life seemed to unleash something that had been lying dormant. Friends and family noticed changes in Stephen's behavior, though none recognized these shifts as warning signs of what was to come. Up until the age of 20, Richards lived with his parents, working for farmers and other locals in the area. He appeared to be settling into the quiet life of a rural Ohio laborer. He even became engaged to a young woman named Anna Milhorn, maintaining a regular correspondence with her that painted him as a devoted and loving fiancé. But Stephen Richards was already living a double life. Richards also met men whom he described as being of questionable occupation. He began passing counterfeit bills he obtained from a man in New York City. The charming young man who attended church every Sunday was secretly consorting with criminals and participating in fraud. This would be the first of many times Richards would use his respectable appearance to hide his true nature. In February 1876, he left Mount Pleasant, heading west for better career opportunities. What Stephen told his fiancée and neighbors was that he was seeking his fortune on the frontier. What he didn't tell them was that he was leaving behind a life that had become too small to contain his growing appetite for something more dangerous than counterfeiting. Stephen's journey west took him first to Iowa, where he found work as a farmhand in Burlington and Morning Sunday. The work was honest but unremarkable, hardly the adventure he'd been seeking. But then opportunity presented itself in an unexpected form. He was later hired as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, Iowa, tasked with burying deceased patients. For most people, This would have been a sobering and perhaps traumatic job. For Stephen Richards, it became a turning point that would shape him into one of America's first documented serial killers. The New York Times wrote that Richards' time working at the asylum was a significant event in his life that shaped his own humanity and view of the human race. Day after day, Stephen handled the bodies of people who had died, forgotten and unmourned. While he denied witnessing any abuse of the asylum's patients, he later reflected that during his tenure of handling and disposing of deceased patients, he became accustomed to viewing people as nothing more than meat. This chilling transformation didn't happen overnight. Month by month, corpse by corpse, Stephen Richards was stripping away his own humanity. The young man who had once sat in Methodist Sunday school was learning to see human life as worthless, death as mundane, and suffering as irrelevant. He was becoming a predator. Richards left the asylum in October of 1876 and began drifting around the Midwestern United States, but he was no longer the same person who had arrived. The seeds of violence had been planted, watered by daily exposure to death, and nurtured by his growing disconnection from human empathy. Finding intermittent work and occasionally consorting with train robbers, he stayed in Kansas City briefly before moving on to Nebraska, where he passed through Hastings before arriving in Kearney. The frontier was the perfect place for someone who wanted to disappear into a new identity. Out here, a man's past didn't matter as much as his ability to survive. According to Richards, he became involved in several gunfights during his stay, resulting in him shooting each individual. Although he stated he was unaware of their condition after each confrontation, even in his own telling, Stephen was already using violence as a solution to problems. The pattern was forming, but the worst was yet to come. In a confession written after his final arrest, Richards admitted to having killed 4 men during his travels around Nebraska and Iowa between 1876 and 1877. These weren't crimes of passion or desperate acts of self-defense. They were calculated acts of violence committed by a man who had learned to kill without conscience. He described committing his first murder sometime in late 1876, 2 weeks after arriving in Kearney. The circumstances, as Stephen later recounted them, revealed the cold calculation that would characterize all his crimes. According to Richards, he met a man while traveling on horseback through the Nebraska countryside, and the pair decided to camp for the night near Dolbytown. What should have been a simple encounter between travelers became Stephen's introduction to murder. Settling down for the night, the two began gambling in a game of cards, with Richards winning most of the stranger's money. As the two set off for Kearney the following morning, the other man turned on Richards and demanded his money back. Richards refused, whereupon he claimed the other man became belligerent. Richards then shot him above the left eye, killing him instantly. After confirming the man was dead, he disposed of the body in the Platte River. What's most chilling about this account isn't just the casual violence, but Stephen's methodical approach to covering his tracks. He checked to make sure the man was dead. He disposed of the body in running water where it would be carried away. This wasn't the panicked reaction of someone who had killed in the heat of the moment. This was the behavior of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. But Stephen Richards was just getting started. Several days later, as he continued his trek to Kearney, Richards encountered another man 15 miles from an area called Walker's Ranch. The man had seen Richards and the previous traveler together, and the stranger asked what had become of that man. While talking to him, Richards realized that this man and the deceased were friends and business partners. Now Stephen faced a choice. He could have simply lied and walked away. Instead, he chose murder. Richards denied any knowledge of the dead man, but his friend continued to hound Richards with questions, which caused Richards to become increasingly anxious. Believing the man knew too much, Richards decided to kill the stranger to prevent any discovery of the murder. When the stranger turned his back to Richards, he was shot in the back of the head. He disposed of the corpse and sold the man's horse in a nearby town. 2 men were now dead because Stephen Richards couldn't bear the thought of being caught, but rather than feeling remorse or fear, Stephen seemed to be gaining confidence in his ability to kill and get away with it. His next stop was telling. Before reaching Kearney, Richards stopped at the home of Jasper Halson, who according to Richards was a train robber. Stephen was gravitating toward other criminals, finding a community of people who lived outside the law. Mary, Jasper's wife, noticed upon his arrival that Richard's shirt was stained with blood and commented on it. Richards had not noticed blood on his clothes and claimed to have replied as if in jest that it must have come from the men he had murdered. That ended the conversation. Even when making what seemed like a joke, Stephen was telling the truth. The mask of respectability was beginning to slip, but not enough for anyone to take him seriously as a threat. The murders continued, with a pattern that would become Stephen's signature. Violence erupting from seemingly ordinary encounters, followed by careful disposal of evidence. After his stay, Richards traveled to Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where he used counterfeit money to purchase a horse and buggy from an unidentified man. After he left, the seller discovered the bills were not genuine. Tracking Richards down, the seller demanded that Richards give him real money or return his horse and buggy. With Richards refusing both demands, the man threatened to have him arrested, and Richards responded by shooting him. He then buried the body and left the area. 3 men were now dead, each killed for increasingly trivial reasons. Stephen was discovering that murder was an easy solution to life's problems, at least for someone who felt no empathy for his victims. The 4th murder revealed just how casually Stephen had come to view human life. In March 1877, Richards and a young man with the surname Jeggy left Grand Island, Nebraska on horseback and headed towards Kearney. As they neared their destination, they stopped and camped for the night between Lell and Kearney along the Platte River. Richards woke up at about 3 a.m. and roused his partner, telling him it was nearly morning and they should get back on the road. Jemji, infuriated at being awakened so early, began arguing with Richards. What happened next, as Richards later recounted it, shows the terrifying banality of evil. "It's a good thing you don't mean all you say," I said. "But I do mean it," he said. "You don't want to mean it," I said, and he picked up his revolver and said, "Here is something that backs all that I say." Cocked it. I looked at him and thought, the fool acts as if he means to shoot, and skipping out my little .33, I plugged him one in the head. That was the first trouble we had ever had. A man was dead over being woken up too early. Stephen's casual language, "plugged him one in the head," reveals how completely disconnected he had become from the humanity of his victims. To him, GMG wasn't a person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved him. He was just an inconvenience to be eliminated. By 1878, Stephen Richards had established a deadly pattern, but his most horrific crimes were yet to come. In June 1878, while in Kearney, Richards was arrested and jailed for larceny. He later claimed that this charge was unfounded. It was during this incarceration that Stephen would meet the woman whose murder would finally bring him to justice. During his time in jail, he reunited with Mary L. Harlson. Shortly before Richards' arrival, she had been arrested under suspicion of having aided the escape of her husband and another prisoner named Underwood, or Nixon, from the Kearney jail. Mary Harson was a woman trying to survive on the frontier with 3 young children, 1 0-year-old Daisy, 4-year-old Mabel, and 2-year-old Jasper, nicknamed Jessie. Her husband was an outlaw who had abandoned her to face legal troubles alone. She was vulnerable, desperate, and exactly the kind of victim Stephen had learned to exploit. Richards and Mary Harson agreed that she would sell him the deed to her property 6 months later for $600, approximately $17,000 in today's money. What seemed like a business arrangement was actually Stephen positioning himself to commit his most heinous crime yet. After Richards was released from jail, he traveled around Nebraska for several months. He did business in Hastings, Bloomington, and Grand Island before arriving at the Harsons' Kearney County homestead on the 18th of October, 1878. Mary Harson transferred the property to Richards upon his arrival, and he stayed there for several weeks. Some reports suggest that Stephen and Mary were married, though this appears to have been part of his scheme to gain legal ownership of her land. The New York Daily Herald later reported that Richards had married Harson on the 2nd of November in what the newspaper alleged was a scam to acquire ownership of Harson's land. But Stephen Richards wasn't content with just stealing Mary's property. He had decided to eliminate any potential witnesses to his previous crimes. A month later, Richards decided to kill Harson and her 3 children. In his confession, Richards claimed that Harson had discovered that he was guilty of murder, and he feared that she might betray his presence to the authorities. To silence Harson and ensure that his previous crimes remained hidden, Richards resolved to murder the entire family. On the 3rd of November, 1878, Richards got up early in the morning along with another man named Brown, who had been staying at the house. What followed was a crime so calculated and cold-blooded that it shocked even hardened frontier lawmen. Brown left to feed the horses and complete other chores around the farm. Richards found a spade and dug a hole, then sneaked back into the house and murdered Mary, Daisy, Mabel, and Jessie with an axe. The details of the murders revealed the depth of Stephen's depravity. He said most of them had died after the first several blows, with the exception of Daisy, who had writhed in pain for some time by Richards' own account. A 10-year-old girl suffered, while Stephen Richards methodically killed her family around her. Richards was said to have scrubbed the blood off of the floor and himself after the murders, before calmly sitting down to breakfast. After annihilating an entire family, Stephen Richards ate a meal in the same house where 4 bodies lay cooling. The casual nature of this act reveals a level of psychological disconnection that defies comprehension. After he had eaten, he carried the bodies out of the house and buried them in the hole he had dug nearby. When later questioned about the Aitsons' disappearance, Richards told several people the family had left with Brown, and he did not know when they would return. For weeks, Stephen maintained this lie, living in the house where he had committed multiple murders, working the land he had stolen, and presenting himself as a man wronged by an ungrateful family who had abandoned him. But Stephen Richards wasn't finished killing. On the 9th of December, 1878, Richards agreed to help his neighbor, a 26-year-old immigrant from Sweden named Peter Anderson, with some work on Anderson's property. Peter Anderson was exactly the kind of person the frontier needed: hard-working, honest, and trusting. These qualities would cost him his life. On the 9th of December, Anderson became ill after eating a meal Richards had prepared, causing him to suspect Richards had poisoned him. Anderson informed a neighbor of his suspicions. The next day, he confronted Richards. The two fought, and Richards either beat Anderson to death with a hammer or hatchet, or shot him. Accounts vary, but the result was the same. Anderson's body was later discovered in the cellar of his house, buried underneath a pile of coal. Even in death, Stephen showed no respect for his victims, treating Peter Anderson's body like refuse to be hidden and forgotten. Richards strongly denied poisoning Anderson, saying that was not his style. He claimed Anderson had attacked him with a knife and that he killed Anderson in self-defense. Even when confessing to his other crimes, Stephen maintained this lie, perhaps because he couldn't admit to the cowardice of poisoning a man before beating him to death. Richards fled Kearney shortly after Anderson's murder, expecting that the bodies would soon be discovered. In the evening, as he was hitching up Anderson's horses and preparing to leave, some of Anderson's neighbors arrived. They had noticed Anderson's absence and questioned Richards about it. He reportedly told them Anderson was inside the house. As Anderson's neighbors entered the dwelling, Richards fled on horseback, riding to Bloomington Stevens. Reign of Terror was finally coming to an end, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He traveled east by horse and train and on foot, passing through Omaha and Chicago. While on the run, he met up with Jasper Harson and Harson's fellow escaped prisoner. The three traveled through Wheeling, West Virginia, and into Ohio, passing through Bridgeport, before arriving in Richards' hometown of Mount Pleasant. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Stephen Richards, who had left Mount Pleasant as a seemingly respectable young man seeking his fortune, was returning as one of the most wanted killers in America. Nebraska Governor Silas Garber issued an arrest warrant for Richards on the 16th of December, 1878, and promised a reward of $200, about $6,000 in today's money, for his arrest and conviction. Most accounts state that on the 20th of December, after Richards arrived in Mount Pleasant, he attended a ballroom dance, accompanied by 2 unidentified women. The audacity of this act, a wanted killer attending a public dance in his hometown, speaks to Stephen's supreme confidence in his ability to manipulate and deceive those around him. But his luck had finally run out. Copies of a wanted poster featuring Richards had been circulated throughout the town recently, and a constable named McGrew recognized him from the poster. He enlisted the help of a penitentiary guard named Fulger. The 2 men armed themselves with shotguns and set off after Richards. They found him walking through a field just outside of town with the 2 women. He was unarmed and quickly surrendered. Richards claimed that he had spotted the officers approaching him, intending to fight his way out of the situation. He told the women to head back to town. They refused, however, so Richards chose to surrender. Even in capture, Stephen was calculating, unwilling to risk the lives of innocent women who might be caught in crossfire. It was perhaps the only moment of human decency he showed during his entire criminal career. If I hadn't had the two girls with me, I guess the Constable McGrew who arrested me would have been a dead man. Either of us would, for I'd have shot. After his arrest, Richards was jailed in Steubenville, Ohio. While there, he wrote 2 articles for the local newspaper, confessing to 9 murders in 3 years. What followed was one of the most chilling confessions in American criminal history. Stephen Richards didn't just admit to his crimes, he described them in detail, showing not an ounce of remorse or regret. "I have killed 9 persons, and I can't say I feel any worse for it." This single sentence encapsulates the moral void at the heart of Stephen D. Richards. Sheriff David Anderson of Buffalo County, Nebraska, and Sheriff Martin of Kearney County, both of whom had pursued Richards to Ohio, returned him to Nebraska. The journey back west would be Stephen's last as a free man. Due to local public outrage, Anderson and Martin feared that Richards would be lynched if he were returned to any of the localities where he had committed his crimes, so it was decided to avoid taking him to these places initially. The anger directed at Stephen Richards was understandable. He had murdered entire families, including small children. He had betrayed trust, violated hospitality, and turned the frontier's code of mutual aid into a weapon against the innocent. At the time of Richards' arrest, authorities suspected he was a member of a gang of outlaws who had plagued the state, or even the group's leader. Law enforcement was able to definitively link Richards to the 9 murders to which he had confessed, and suggested that he might have killed even more. Richards' trial began on the 16th of January, 1879 in Minden, Nebraska, with Judge William Gaslin presiding. The prosecution was led by a district attorney named Schofield, and Richards' defense was led by a lawyer named Savage. Schofield laid out 2 indictments for murder in the first degree, for the killings of the Harson family and Anderson. Richards pled not guilty, arguing that Anderson's killing was in self-defense and therefore justifiable. The trial was a formality. Stephen had already confessed to the crimes in detail, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The prosecution called 7 witnesses to the stand. They all testified to the state in which Anderson was found. Richards then was called to testify. When questioned by Schofield, he admitted to killing Anderson with a hammer after a heated argument, but reiterated that he had done so in self-defense. Richards said that although repeatedly warned not to do so, Anderson had reached for a nearby hatchet. After 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found Richards guilty of the murders of the Harsons and Anderson. He was sentenced to death by hanging, and his execution date was set for the 26th of April, 1879. Richards was described as being cheerful and indifferent to both the proceedings and his conviction. Even facing death, Stephen Richards felt nothing, no fear, no regret, no recognition of the gravity of what he had done. Sheriff Martin announced that his execution in mind would be open to the public. Even though Martin feared the attendance of a large number of spectators could become violent, the execution of Stephen D. Richards would become one of the most dramatic public spectacles in Nebraska history. Spectators at the execution were said to have numbered between 2,000 and 25,000. The wide range in estimates speaks to the chaos of the day, but it's clear that thousands of people came to witness the end of the Nebraska Fiend. As the crowd became increasingly agitated, the authorities pleaded with them to stay outside the enclosure, but guards were unable to prevent the spectators from destroying the barrier. The crowd's anger at Stephen Richards was so intense that they physically tore down the barriers meant to control them. At 1 p.m., Richards was led to the gallows by Martin and his deputy. This pacified the crowd. Upon ascending the gallows, Richards launched into an impassioned defense of his actions. He again claimed that the killing of Anderson was in self-defense and disavowed any involvement in the murders of the Harson family. Even with the noose around his neck, Stephen Richards was still lying, still manipulating, still trying to present himself as something other than what he was. He then said he had found the Lord, made his peace with God, and had faith in Christ, and asked the crowd to join him in singing the hymn, "Come Thou of Every Blessing." Richards' final words were said to have been, "Jesus, be with me now." At 1:17 p.m. on the 26th of April, 1879, Richards was hanged. The St. Louis Globe Democrat said it took 15 minutes for him to die. Richards was the first person in Nebraska's history to be executed since its incorporation into the United States in 1867. After his arrest, many people described Richards as charismatic, commenting that he successfully concealed his dark nature under a polite, articulate, and handsome exterior. This ability to charm and manipulate made Stephen Richards particularly dangerous. Contemporary observers remarked that Richards seemed to feel no guilt whatsoever about his crimes. When asked about his lack of empathy, Stephen sometimes gave conflicting responses, but one answer stands out as particularly chilling. When the Nebraska State Journal questioned him about his lack of remorse for the heinous murders he had committed, particularly those of the Harlson family, Richards recounted an event from his childhood. He had been tasked to kill a litter of kittens, and did so by bashing each of their heads against a tree. After he had killed all the kittens, he found that he felt no guilt about it and found the killing fun. This childhood incident reveals that Stephen's capacity for violence and lack of empathy weren't products of his frontier experiences or his time at the asylum. The seeds of his monstrous nature had been planted much earlier. Criminal psychology and profiling was not used as an investigative technique until the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, 9 years after Richards' execution. In 2018, forensic psychologist Catherine Ramsland referred to Richards as the Old West's Ted Bundy. Both Richards and Bundy used their charisma to manipulate others, and both displayed a complete lack of remorse for their crimes. The comparison to Ted Bundy is apt. Both men were handsome, articulate, and able to present themselves as trustworthy. Both used this facade to gain access to victims, and both killed without conscience or remorse. Shortly after his execution, a photographer was able to capture a photograph of Richards' corpse propped inside a coffin. Even in death, Stephen Richards was treated as a curiosity, a specimen to be studied and gawked at. Local doctor sounded Richards before his execution, requesting him to donate his body for medical purposes. He refused and was buried in mind. Despite his gravesite being guarded, his corpse was stolen the night after his execution, the Sedalia Weekly. Bazoo suspected the doctors who had wanted to examine him, but was returned to its resting place shortly thereafter. Sometime later, his body was dug up once again. This time Richards' bones were scattered on the streets of Kearney. The final indignity came when on the 1st of November, 1882, it was reported that Kearney County Gazette had obtained Richards' skull and placed it on display in the newspaper's office window. In modern times, Richards is now acknowledged as Nebraska's first documented serial killer. His case provides a window into the psychology of serial murder in an era before such crimes were understood or properly investigated. The story of Stephen D. Richards serves as a reminder that evil isn't always obvious. It can hide behind a charming smile, a respectable appearance, and even religious devotion. The most dangerous predators are often those who seem the least threatening, those who know how to exploit our trust and our humanity against us. Richards killed at least 9 people that we know of. He destroyed families, traumatized communities, and left scars on the Nebraska frontier that lasted for generations. His crimes were made possible not just by his own moral emptiness, but by a society that was too trusting, too isolated, and too unprepared to recognize the monster in its midst. The Nebraska Fiend is gone, but the lessons of his case remain. Evil exists. It's often hidden in plain sight, and the price of failing to recognize it can be measured in innocent lives lost. The case of Stephen D. Richards shows us that the capacity for evil has existed throughout human history, even in times and places we might consider simpler or more innocent. If you found this case as disturbing and fascinating as we did, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime history. What do you think drove Stephen Richards to become a killer? Was it his childhood trauma, his experience at the asylum, or was there something fundamentally wrong with him from the beginning? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our other videos on America's most notorious criminals. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next.